James Mather, sound supervisor for Kenneth Branagh's new film Belfast. James, obviously a very personal project for Kenneth. I know in so much of it feels like an active memory that he's pulling from, I guess. What were your initial conversations like with him about how the film should sound, based on, like, I'm sure he had a lot of thoughts about how, about how it would sound because it's coming from such a personal place. So I guess, like, what were those conversations like initially?
They were very, he had some very strong ideas of memories that he perceived with sound. And when he wrote the script, he included a lot of those in there. And one of the, I mean, we've done about 5 or 6 films with him, maybe more. And one of the things that we enjoy so much about working with Ken is that he's very keen for you to bring to the show your own ideas and your own perceptions of what you see. So quite often we'll watch the movie in silence just to get a notion of the rhythm and the kind of the visual impact without any extra impetus. And so influence. And so the first thing we did is we went through and we did a sketch of what we thought it should be, how it should sound, playing on the period of time and everything else. And then we spent a good few hours going through with Ken and just pushing and pulling ideas and then investing in other notions that he felt might be interesting to emphasize the point of view from Buddy, the child actor in the film, the child character in the film. And from that point on, we worked closely together pretty much all the way through. We'd see him. We were in lockdown, of course, so it wasn't full lockdown. We could work in bubbles, but it meant for us we had a lot of access to Ken, and he to us, and we'd spend a lot of time together throughout the whole process, and all the way through the mix. He was with us all day, every day, which is really rare. I can't think of the last time I worked on a production where we had so much input from the filmmaker and the person whose story this was, that it was such a personal project. So it was kind of unique in that way. I mean, we know him very well. We know what he likes about a soundtrack. He likes clarity. He likes the dialogues to really, he doesn't like an audience to have to work to understand what's being said. And in his words, he felt this, that he always perceives the post-sound process as another go at the script, as another opportunity to put another draft of the script together, because it allows him to consider additional lines that might work from crowd artists around the location, just to emphasize the moment and what is going on. And knowing that from working with him, we kind of had a lot of that in mind as we started. But it grew like all these productions grow from the first seed of the first sounds that were put in. There's a lot of work that the editor did, but most of it was predominantly the music tracks that were added and where they wanted to have music. And in a very beautiful way for us, as the soundtrack built, music diminished in a lot of places. So we started with a heavier track count than we ended up with, which is I always find is a good sign, because it gives you the confidence that the soundtrack we're creating is working in conjunction with the music and not having to be led by the music, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. Can you talk a little about, like, obviously I was going to ask you about that, because it does feel like so much of the film, obviously the film is from Buddy's perspective, but I feel like so much of the sound is too. And I don't know how else to, like, it just seems like it's like you couldn't even, you know what I mean? It's like an unperceptible thing that I'm like, oh, it is seemingly sound like it's from, like, a child might hear it, or, like, you know what I mean? Like, from how loud a lot of the breaking glasses and, like, the unrest scenes, or, like, even, like, the initial explosion in that opening scene is so, it really shakes you, like, out of your seat. Was that this kind of stuff you talked with Ken about, or, like, what were specifics?
Absolutely. He very much wanted to strike a peak in contrast between the happy-go-lucky playing in the streets, innocence of childhood, community combined, a community connected through people and trust. And he wanted that to be smashed, because that was his memory. It was like childhood was over when the riot started. And he talks about, he couldn't quite understand what this noise was. There was a blur at the end of the street, and and he couldn't. He thought it was bees. He wasn't sure. It didn't make sense to him. There were bees near where he lived, near the park. And so the moment it explodes, all those sort of perceptions are shattered into reality of the hard bricks and glass and brutality and violence and edge. And this in fact was one of the first instances where we had a music track running through the riot. It kind of built up as the camera rotates around Buddy, and then went into this very dynamic track. It was a Van Morrison track, I believe. And strangely, the track gave an energy to the riot, which made it slightly less aggressive and less dangerous. It allowed you to bounce along with the track rather than feeling like you were immersed in this chaos. And so we worked hard to make the sound effects work in time with the music and pitch bangs and clangs so that they weren't too ugly with the track. And then when we took the music away, it was like taking the scaffold away. We were left with this suspension of sound effects, which all had a rhythm to them. And they also had tonality to them. Stones hitting the dustbin lid shield that she was using, the mother was using. And it allowed us to then pile in a little more, but more than that, it allowed us to pile in some really aggressive shouts and instructions from the rioters and abuse hurled through to families in their houses as they were trying to escape. And that rhythm of a shout, a window smash, a shout, a gutter smash, and all that stuff. And it suddenly made it incredibly visceral and incredibly urgent and terrifying. And that was very much what he wanted. And I think the whole process for him as we were developing this was him kind of embracing what he had remembered to being a reality, if you know what I mean. The memory of something is always, you imagine it's one thing, and then you remember it going back to it and thinking, actually, no, you're right. It was a lot more aggressive. It was a lot more violent. It was a lot more terrifying. I've sanitized it in my years of sort of filtering it. So there was an opportunity at the beginning to really set the tone for the film. Helicopters, newsreaders on the TV, shouting from the rioters, shouting from the neighbors to each other as he walks. The day after the riot, he walks down the street and you hear neighbors calling out to each other, building the barricade and fixing the windows. And it just really helped put you in the boy's situation, that he is surrounded by this world of his community. One minute it's, like I said, full of joy, and the next minute it's full of action, and they're getting each other ready for battle and protecting their residents. And that carried through the whole film. There are places where we've used sound in a much more impactful way, particularly in the cinema clips where he's watching a movie clip, and the sound we augmented in a big way to give it the full immersive Atmos experience. A lot of the soundtrack is pretty LCR, pretty up the front only, with a little bit of detail for helicopters and what have you around you. But when you kick into the impact of the cinema, he wanted that to be as he remembered it being on him. This big thing that was overwhelming and slightly sort of awe-inspiring. And so we did that wherever there was an opportunity, making voices seemingly bigger and more cavernous and more threatening. Authority had a reverb on it, wherever it may be, whether it's in the living room or the church or the ceremony. So there were techniques that one wouldn't normally use to emphasize Buddy's perspective. Ken and Simon, the dialogue editor and co-supervisor with me on this, work very well together because Ken's such a fastidious, and he loves dialogue, and he loves to make sure that every nuance and phrase and consonant is clear. And there were some lovely moments where we're locked on Buddy while he's listening to his parents talking, and we're just on Buddy for the whole piece. And Simon sort of decided, let's try pulling the dialogues off the screen a bit. Let's move them around just enough so that you feel like you're hearing it from Buddy's seating place. And it was great fun. There's a lot of things that you wouldn't do normally because sometimes it'll throw you out. More often than not, those kind of techniques will throw you out of the moment. But in this case, it actually kept you locked in with Buddy. And some things you didn't need to hear, you didn't need to understand, like the TV stuff chattering away in the background. And that was a deliberate ploy to get you to stay with Buddy, who's playing with his toys in the foreground. We're hearing the world as he heard it. There's stuff going on, but his parents are talking or whatever, but we're with him and it's his perception.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really incredible, and it creates such an evocative, I think, feeling and sense of place and time. And James Mather, sound supervisor for Kenneth Branagh's Belfast. We have to wrap up here, but thank you so much. It's great hearing you talking about the film.
Thank you.
Julian Slater, re-recording mixer and supervising sound editor, and a two-time Oscar nominee for Baby Driver, who reunited with Edgar Wright for Last Night in Soho. Julian, this is obviously Edgar's homage, tribute maybe to like classic giallo films, or maybe even something like a Brian De Palma film. Half the movie takes place in the 60s. When you started talking to him about the sound design, were those conversations like, was that kind of like built in? Like, how did you guys talk about how it would sound, I guess? And like, would you try to like harken back to those things that it's referencing?
Yeah, I think the main initial starting point with him talking, in early discussions, was the two worlds of Soho. Actually, it wasn't necessarily the reference to the 60s or the movies that were perhaps inspiring Edgar. It was very much Soho being this place of, it's a movie of two worlds anyway, between modern day Ellie's Soho and 1960s Sandy Soho, but also Soho in of itself is this split personality place that, I spent most of my life working in, and it's it's a bustling metropolitan place by day, and then by evening it turns into this kind of huge nightclub with various different streets playing out as different areas of the nightclub, and then into the night it starts to get much darker. So the initial kind of conversation was, how do we make the two worlds of Soho, night and day, become this kind of play on that, become kind of light and darker, and using those two worlds. And then once we got stuck into it, I think we came on, week 2 of director's cut, because Edgar likes to get us on pretty early. And that's when we started to think about, okay, what can we try and do with this show that's perhaps different to what we've done before? And then you think of like the era, 1960s, there was a lot going on, not only the movies that we're kind of paying homage to, but in music technology, there was a lot going on, a lot was changing in the 60s. And we kind of, we decided to go on a much more kind of analog route that we would normally go with. And perhaps, the way that Edgar shot it, there's a lot of in-camera stuff. And so I feel like it's quite an organic movie in of itself. So with that in mind, we kind of went back and used a lot of old techniques, the filtering of dialogue, the echoes, the things happening obviously in time with the music, which is something we've done before, and just using delays and referencing dialogue from previous scenes and looping them around and working them into the score to try and make it. At times it becomes a bit Beatlesque with what we're doing with the dialogue and all the sound design. Our composer Stephen Price kind of referenced Revolution Number 9. So yeah, it was very much a journey of discovery, perhaps more on this than Edgar's previous efforts, I would say.
It's amazing. You obviously also, like you mentioned music, you have obviously like live or like a lot of like singing in the film too. Obviously Anya's character sings downtown and stuff. It's an incredible, a cappella rendition. It's just, the scene is it's very memorable, I guess. And I guess, can you talk a little about having to execute that? I think that seems like, again, like a high degree of difficulty that you guys seemingly pull off very easily, or at least it looks very easily. I imagine it was not. So I guess, can you talk about
Yeah, I mean, the surprise of that was Anya's voice. I had no idea of how amazing she is as a singer. And so, that scene was all about doing a slow focus, try and focus in on what she's doing over the course of what she's singing. So we start off with the everyday, when she's singing, there's outside Soho happening. She's actually she's in situation, she's in the environment very much so. And then as we pull through that sequence, we focus in on her, we take everything out, and the reverb that's added to her has got much more of a sparkle to it. So, we start off here and we end up here with just trying to turn the perception of what's happening. And it's her real, she's giving this performance which is dazzling us all and dazzling the people she's trying to impress. So that was the plan there.
Yeah. How about for obviously the knives and sharp objects are a huge thing. I think that, like, in the film, how do you make them sound so? I don't know. In this film, I felt like it just sounds scarier to me in certain places than I have in other horror films, or I wouldn't even call this a horror film, maybe, or thrillers and stuff. I guess, can you talk a little about making those sound effects like really, I don't know, like they really pop, I think, in the film, and they sound like dangerous almost, I guess, for lack of a better word.
Well, the movie for us was very much an exercise in restraint as much as anything else. The movie starts on a number 1 and ends up on a number 10, and we try and do the slow build to what we get to number 10. It's like the first 24 minutes are pretty much in mono down the front, and then when she goes into Soho for the first time, we open it up so there's a bigger contrast between going 5/1 to Atmos, we go mono to Atmos. And I guess that's kind of what we try to do throughout. By the time we get to the thing where we're seeing the knives on the screen, we're punching those through because we've been restrained up to that point. And in fact, Edgar was great. Edgar, who's not necessarily the most restrained when it comes to sound, because he loves playing in the playground, the sonic playground. He would be the one who would say to us, look, at this moment in time, let's just peel back. Let's pare back. Let's not have this and not have that. Let's keep our powder dry for the scene coming up in 20 minutes time. So I think doing those things and holding back and having restraint gives you the dynamic power to kind of come in stronger and harder later in the movie. Yeah,
that definitely makes sense. Obviously, like you said, you've worked with Edgar before. He's an incredible filmmaker, and I do think like his films have a very specific sonic, like, feel and sound, not for lack of a better word, I guess. How's your working relationship with him developed, and like, what do you like about, getting to work with him, I guess?
I love working with him because he's the best of everything. He constructs an amazing environment for someone like myself to play in. He has these initial ideas, but then he throws the ball over to me and my sound team, and I guess also based on nearly 20 years of working with him, there is no fear of failure. There is no, and the whole crew is well versed in working together. It's the same composer, same editor, same even DOP, who I know. I don't know many DOPs, but I know I know the DOP on this, and the production designer Marcus Rowland, and that all feeds into this kind of exchange of ideas. And for example, with knowing Steve Price as a friend, who's the composer, it's that thing of exchanging ideas back and forth all the time, and having, I can suggest things to Steve I would possibly not dare to suggest to other composers, because, at the end of the day, we'll probably end up going for a pint together. And that, I think, does breed a rare creativity that I don't find that often in my other productions.
Yeah, and the last thing here before we wrap up, I guess, like, what was the biggest challenge for you on this one, or what was something that you guys had a problem solve and like figure out that you were really excited about once you kind of cracked it?
I think it was what is scary these days. That's I'm aware that for whatever reason, like I've got 2 boys who are 13 and 11. They don't get scared at movies anymore. They just don't get scared. We went round the houses trying to make scary noises, and then realized what was scary was this unsettling thing of playing things that everyday sounds slightly different. And Ellie hearing voices from the past, or hearing voices and filtering them and doing this kind of weird dissonance with them, is actually really creepier than just coming in with a sledgehammer and having kind of crazy sound design sounds, which are great and I've used all the time, far too much in fairness, like we all have. But it was the cracking for us, cracking what is scary. We've got at the beginning of the movie, people outside Ellie's flat apartment jokingly arguing with each other, and then later on in the movie, it's an aggressive argument, and it's twisting everyday sounds to be a bit more scary and put you on edge, as opposed to and realizing that it's everyday sounds are capable of doing that, I'd say.
Yeah, it really works very well, and like you said, I think the movie does go from builds and builds and builds until it reaches a pretty wonderful conclusion. Julian Slater, re-recording mixer and supervising sound editor for Last Night in Soho. Thank you so much, Julian.
Thank you.
Tara Webb, sound effects editor and re-recording mixer for Jane Campion's film The Power of the Dog. Tara, I was fortunate enough to speak with Ari Wegner, the cinematographer from Power of the Dog, and she talked about how fastidious Jane was in her preparation and how much prep time that she had and like you guys had on the film. I guess so. I want like, how did that attention to detail that she has and kind of preparedness help you on the sound front?
Yeah, I mean, working with Jane was such an awesome experience. She has such a strong focus on character and story, as do most, but really, really strongly. And so a lot of the conversations early on was about that, and how, because the performances of the film are so subtle and delicate, and how she really wanted to approach the sound the same way. And so we when we came on, they were still in the edit. So we were able to feed through, ideas and that kind of thing through to them in the edit, which was a great kind of back and forth, getting feedback. And so by the time the lock came, Jane had already heard a lot of things already, and then we could sit down and really kind of dig in and work through what she liked, what she didn't like, and kind of just continue to build on that, it's always great when we can work with the edit in conjunction. I think it always makes for a better end product.
Yeah, for sure. So you mentioned what were some of the things that she was very much looking for, or that you guys were able to collaborate with her with?
Well, I think we spoke a lot about creating that expanse of Montana and the ranch, and then on the flip side, then versus the Burbank house, which was quite visually cold and oppressive, and creating that as well. So we spoke a lot about the background, the atmos, and then of course about just keeping to those performances, keeping everything about what's happening on screen and those performances, and not having too much sound to distract from that. And I think the wonderful thing of how it was shot with those expanses and then the close-ups, it really allowed us to kind of do that with the sound. We would have these quite sparse environments, and then we would cut into the rolling a cigarette or the rope braiding, and we could really detail that with Foley and design.
Yeah, no, it's great. I wanted to ask you a lot. I love those insert shots. Like you said, I think they really are so powerful and nuanced, and they really do kind of add to it. I guess how do you make find the perfect cigarette rolling sound, or the perfect rope, making, or even there's I think there he cuts open, he cuts I forget, it's the scarf or a silk sheath, like a knife. It just is all these very small things that sound really incredible, and obviously, because the film is so contemplative and nuanced, it really does stand out. And I guess, can you talk a little about defining those sounds and making them sound like they do?
Well, we have a great Foley team, Mario Vaccaro, who I think he's so good at doing detail for those kind of things as well. And our sound designer, Dave Whitehead, he got a lot of the props from set, and he spent a few days, with the saddle and everything, recording everything and creating this amazing library. With Phil's boots as well, the spurs. And then there was a lot of location sound that Richard had recorded as well, which was really fantastic, especially Phil's boots, that, solid sound in the house and that kind of thing. So it was about, I guess a lot of just trial and error, and seeing, when it came to me for the effects mix, I did spend a lot of time, working out, okay, can we use all three together? Can we have sync effects, Dave's design, and the Foley, or sometimes, and I'd try to make it work, because there was a lot of times where they all had their own element that brought something to it. So in other cases I might be like, oh, let's just go with the sync for this, because it's just easier. But for this film I spent a lot of time, because that was kind of the focus in terms of the effects side of things, spending time seeing if we could make it work with all three, or whether it was just a combo of two, or on that kind of thing.
Right. How about for another, you mentioned the Burbank house and stuff, and obviously Phil's guitar, I think, is such a, it's so menacing and threatening, and I guess I feel it could have sounded a lot of different ways, even as I'm sure the instrument sounds like it does, but I feel the way you guys, it just sounds so menacing, I guess. And can you talk about finding the right mix and how you guys kind of did that, especially when he's using it to taunt Kirsten Dunst's character, of course, it's just so menacing, like I said. And I just love, how did you guys think of that, and how did you kind of work on that?
Yeah, I guess that kind of came about in the mix because, you know, having then access to the Dolby Atmos. I mean, the banjo player that we had come on during the edit, he was so good. Like in the recordings, like he'd just watch it and play. He wouldn't have to do 2 takes. It would just he'd just be watching it, and then it was just amazing. It was so cool to watch. But yeah, I think for that scene in particular, it was definitely a lot to do with using Dolby Atmos. So, you know, because obviously Phil is up on the stairs, and then when he's looking down on Rose, and really, you know, it's not the only scene where he's in that kind of position. We've used his boots and stuff throughout the film to kind of do that as well. I think we slowly kind of come into Rose's perspective. So I think when it starts, he's up on the stairs and she's down in the piano, and then as it kind of builds and builds, that tension builds, you know, it starts panning in through to the center to really create that kind of be in Rose's head and that tension that she's feeling.
Yeah, I apologize. I called it a guitar. I know it was a banjo.
Oh.
My mistake. Obviously you mentioned Jane. You know, she's obviously an incredible filmmaker, one of the most you know, recognized and lauded in the last like 50 years, let's say. You know, what surprised you, or what were you so excited about getting to work with her up close like that? What maybe surprised you?
I guess from a personal level, it's always a joy to be able to have the opportunity to work with a female director. And Jane is also actively supports female creatives in her team. I briefly worked with her on Top of the Lake too. I just came on at the end just to help with the mix, just assist in the mix. And it was the first time I'd ever been in a mix room where there was an equal amount of women and men. So it was a great experience for me. And yeah, I just love that she's just very focused on the story, which, you know, whenever I think about sound and stuff, I'm always, you know, love just trying to focus on whether or not it's right for whether it's helping the story or not. It doesn't, like, there might be something that could be cool to do, but is it really helping the story? No. And I really love that Jane has such a strong focus on that, and the performances, and, you know, the dialogue is just so important in her films. And yeah, it was a great experience.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it is interesting, the dialogue I love, because it's like they're all so closed and internalized that when they do speak, it is just like, you know, it's so powerful, and I think it does come through, especially when you have like, I just, you know, the tenor of the voices. I just love Jesse Plemons and Benedict Cumberbatch. Their voices are so rich, I feel like, so it also adds like another layer to their the sound of their performance. I think is really, really cool. Last thing here before we wrap up, Tara, what was like for you the biggest challenge, or something that you were so, you know, like maybe like, oh, this is not working, and then you were so excited to actually get it right, I guess? For
me, it was always that concern maybe we were stripping back too much of the sound, because we did want to we were trying to create that stylized naturalism, but, you know, really not take focus off what was happening. So we did strip back a lot, and more so in the mix. And I guess it was always a worry that, oh, perhaps we've taken too much out, it's going to throw the audience a bit. But I hope and think that in the end we found a really good balance between, you know, just having enough that it, you know, the audience feels the environment that they're in, and then also then focuses on the sounds that you do hear, which help with that tension and suspense. And
yeah, absolutely. It's a beautiful film and wonderful work. Tara Webb, sound effects editor and re-recording mixer for Power of the Dog. Thank you so much, Tara. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Erik Aadahl and Ethan Van Der Ven, Oscar nominees for the first Quiet Place, who are supervising sound editors for Quiet Place Part 2. I love the opening of the film so much. Obviously, it takes place on the first day of the alien attack. The opening sounds are very solid. You have the traffic light clicking up from like red to, or from green to red, excuse me, and then the car speeds in. I guess, can you talk about how you guys landed on that initial mix to really kind of like throw the audience into this first day?
Well, yeah. The opening of the film was very fun, and to me, it kind of reflects what I think of as sort of the magic of sound design. It can really twist your expectations and flip them on your head. And for anybody who'd seen the first film coming into Part 2, they'd think, okay, now we're back into this this universe where sound is deadly, where any sound you make could be a matter of life and death. And so we start in what seems like this abandoned town with just a little bit of wind flapping a flag in the distance, and this street light that's creaking in the wind, and you hear the little tick of one light turn to the next, and then vroom, there's this big truck engine, and John Krasinski's character, the Abbott patriarch, pulls in, and you realize, oh, this actually takes place before the first film. And what I love is it's kind of flipping expectations on its head. And that was John's idea, to start the film that way. But what I really like about the opening is it's kind of then a slow burn, because there's this tension of what you know is about to happen. And we're following the routine of this character, Lee Abbott, going to the grocery store, yanking the plastic wrapper to bag his oranges, and these very specific sounds that in the first movie would be deaf, are too loud. They just kind of pile up one by one. And, he walks to the Little League game and there's a dog barking at something. You don't know what it is, but the dog has this premonition. And it's kind of like this day in the life where we're just playing the reality of this town and this situation with no music. And then Little League game starts, and which Michael Borowski, the production sound mixer, did an incredible job collecting all these voices, and another dog at the game who also has another premonition who's barking. And that became kind of the spine of that setup. And then something strange happens in the sky, and that's where the film takes a turn, where all this tension, this slow burn, is building up to this moment, and things change. And I should let you kind of continue with
well, right. So things change, and the creatures, start streaming, through the sky, and then it's total chaos on the ground. And the beautiful thing about the chaos is it gave us a place to go, which we're sort of craving for in the first film, in the sense that, in the first film, we established this idea that at times in the movie, we go right into the sonic perspective of different characters, but specifically Regan, the daughter, who is deaf. And of course, to live in a world where sound is everything, sound, is the difference between surviving and not surviving, and to have your hearing compromised in that universe is such a vulnerable place to be, that, the idea of going right into her sonic perspective is just incredibly powerful. And so with the opening of this part 2, we were able to go into her sonic perspective in the middle of this total chaos. And that provided such a sort of powerful contrast between, the perspective of the audience, which is the perspective of, all the other hearing people in this world, and Regan's perspective, which of course is just this sort of dull, muffled sort of beating, basically the sound of the blood, pumping through her veins. And so that was super, exciting for us to be able to, right off the bat, sort of establish that idea, and to take it further than we were able to go in part 1.
Yeah, it's really incredible. And I think what you said there about like how just the sound telling a story is so great. Like you mentioned, like the Little League game, I felt like, and I would love to, you guys wonder if you did this. I was getting I was getting emotional because it's such like the platonic ideal of what a Little League baseball game in a small town would sound like, and knowing that this is like the last time that's going to happen in this world, right? Because of the aliens, it just was like, it was like kind of really emotional. And I was just like, can you talk, was that something that you guys were thinking of when you were doing that mix, and like making it sound like as perfect of a small town event as possible, I guess, on this last day before sound becomes this terrible thing that now is going to get people killed by aliens, basically?
Absolutely. We really needed to create the contrast between, the most idyllic kind of small town life with families and community, because the flip side of that is when that community gets ripped apart. And you can think of the film as a metaphor for many things, including the pandemic now in hindsight, where people actually had to learn to survive in quarantine, and so there's something to us that was very kind of profound and emotional about creating that contrast. I think the way John approached the script, of course, sound is central. It's in the DNA of this story, and he'd written it very specifically into the script. The family has to kind of learn how to use sound in order to survive. But the thread, I think, that made it work for me, the way John approached it, was from pre-invasion to post-invasion, the connection with family is there the entire time. That's the running theme. And if we didn't have characters that we really cared about and could, through sound, create intimacy with, it's amazing when you start to get really quiet. There's this incredible effect where an audience actually starts to lean in and really open their ears and feel a much more intimate connection with characters. And so where we have this film which gets so quiet and there's just little whispers and details and touches, there's something that, to me, it creates a really strong connection between the audience and the characters. And in a way, what we tried to do through the entire film was to put the audience into the shoes of the characters using sound through, as Ethan mentioned, using sonic POVs, but also just that very delicate intimacy, which sound has this power to be able to achieve.
And I guess we have to wrap up, but last thing, you obviously mentioned like having Reagan as like the central thing. I guess when you guys is that something you talked to Millicent about, like how did you guys find like what that would sound like for the character, obviously, because
well, actually, what Millicent's mom actually described to John what Millie's sort of sense of hearing was, what it was like for her, and then he described it to us, and then we took his description of her experience and we related it to an experience that both Erik and I had, which was that of being in an anechoic chamber, which is a room that's completely sound isolated. So you don't hear any sound from the outside world. And after about 5, maybe 10 minutes of being in one of these rooms, just being there quietly by yourself, your ears start to open up to the point where you start hearing the sound of your own blood pumping through your veins, and you start to hear the ringing of your own nervous system. You start to hear your own body. And so that's sort of what we used as our inspiration for creating her sonic envelopes.
It's incredible. Yeah. Erik Aadahl, Ethan Van der Ven, Quiet Place Part 2. Thank you so much for doing this. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Tony Lamberti, re-recording mixer and sound designer for Spider-Man No Way Home. Tony, this is your third Spider-Man film with John Watts. How did you talk about your approach to this one coming in for the presumably final chapter of this, at least the final of these 3 Peter Parker films?
Exactly. Well, we knew going into this one that there was a progression from the very first movie, Homecoming, through Far From Home, and then going to this one, No Way Home. And we knew that there were going to be some multiversal elements that were going to come to the fore, and that we were going to have some visitors. And we didn't know exactly what visitors those were going to be, but we knew that whatever it was going to be, we were going to have to take it and really take it to the highest level in order to get it to the finale that John wanted.
Right. So you mentioned that, like, we don't have to spoil it, though. I mean, it's made $1 billion. I'm sure a lot of people watching this already know a lot of things, and obviously the trailers have a lot of the Spider-Man villains. So going on that, you have elements of the Sam Raimi films, and obviously the Mark Webb Spider-Man films, and then the John films as well. How did that approach your sound? Like, obviously, like, people are so familiar with, like, let's say, like, the Green Goblin's, like, bombs, like, the way they plink, and, like, the Dr. Octopus's tentacles, and even Electro's, like, electricity. I mean, how did that, like, I guess, how did that affect, or, like, how did you guys figure out, like, how to make that sound to make it so it was familiar, obviously, to the audiences who watch those films over 20 years, but maybe slightly different and or ajar because it's in your own universe?
Well, we had gone back through the previous movies and listened to that material and familiarized ourselves with that material. And then realized that, some of that stuff was made 20 years ago. And so we, as using it as a thread and as a kind of a kernel of an idea, we were able to refashion it and redesign from scratch, using, today's technology and techniques that we've developed over time in order to make a new version, a new 2021 version of those sounds for the characters of Doc Ock's tentacles, like you said, Green Goblin, the glider, that kind of stuff. So it was a great archaeological expedition to go back and revisit those things, but then take that and take it to the next level.
Right. Yeah. No, that makes sense. One of the things I was so impressed with the film, I think, is that obviously there's a lot of the action scenes, there's a lot of spectacle, a lot of big scenes, and I feel like especially towards the end when you have multiple villains and multiple heroes, let's say, to avoid spoilers, I feel like it's very clear of who's doing what. And obviously, I guess, can you talk a little about like making sure, like, I don't know, like the Webbs are sounding a specific, like how did you guys delineate between like all of the different heroes, let's say?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Each one of the Spideys over the years has had different web shooter sounds. So we went through and culled those out because those were very specific, and those were the types of things where John Watt, the director, was like, I just got to have it exactly like it was. And so that, in conjunction with the dialogue, because they're all in masks, we had to make sure you understood which one was speaking at which time, which Kevin O'Connell did a great job making sure all the dialogue was placed in such a way that it was like you knew which character you were with at any given time, whether you're with Toby, whether you're with Andrew, whether you're with Tom Holland. So that's how we kind of helped keep it all straight when all the crazy action started happening for the big finale.
Yeah. How about you mentioned like the multiverse aspect of it. How do you like, I guess where'd you start, or how do you think about like creating multiverse? Obviously at the end, like it kind of is ripping open. So you see like it's kind of coming in, like you have a bunch of different, maybe people from different universes coming in perhaps. And I guess, how did you guys think of how that kind of thing would sound? Like obviously like we were saying, like the Webbs and all those things are stuff that people maybe are familiar with and are kind of like can grasp onto, but how do you create something like that, or maybe it's like new to the audience that they have to kind of understand what it is, but also like, want to make it not too obtuse, I guess, or for lack of a better word. Yeah.
Well, the way we approached it was, that the picture editors, Jeff Ford and Lee Folsom Boyd, they were really instrumental in terms of kind of giving us the conceptual idea of what ultimately we were going to see. Visual effects wise, because that was the whole third act was something that came in very, very late, later than any other Spider-Man that we've been, associated with. And, so they kind of give us conceptual ideas, like we think this guy is going to be tearing. We're going to, and they're going to allow these other creatures and or characters to potentially come through while Doctor Strange is trying to hold them back. And so we started with, different elements in terms of trying to make tearing sounds. Dry ice cracking is really great. There's all just, rocks ripping and all that kind of stuff. And then over time, once we started seeing the visuals develop, we, kind of crafted something that was custom to what we were actually seeing in terms of its duration and length and where it was playing in the space and all that kind of stuff. So it was a challenge, but it was, and it happened so late in the process that, we were flying by the seat of our pants, but it turned out great. And then everybody seems to really respond to it.
Yeah, it's very cool, and it works. It sounds great, honestly. You mentioned like obviously the third film and like kind of the trilogy of Spider-Man for Tom Holland and kind of the character's evolution. Obviously, the first film is much more like, I think, indebted to like high school films or like coming of age films, like a John Hughes vibe. And this film and the films have grown up obviously with the character. How do you play into that with sound? Like, does the sound like? Is there a way to make it sound more mature, I guess, for what I mean? Like, you watch it growing up.
In terms of the acting, obviously Tom Holland and Zendaya, they give amazing performances in terms of the emotion. Like this particular Spider-Man had way more emotion, way more emotional moments in it to be able to play off of than any other previous movies. And they did an amazing job. So our job in that respect is to just let the actors do the acting and just kind of get out of their way and let them have it. But so it's whether it's peeling back, letting music carry the day, and or there were moments where we took music out completely, like when Andrew Garfield goes after and rescues Zendaya as to give himself the moment that he never had in the movie where he lost Gwen Stacy. So that we actually peeled all the music out and let all the sound effects drive that. So it was just finding which moments we were going to drive with music, which with sound effects, what we were going to let the dialogue carry the day, those kind of things, and just shape it around the emotional moments to let them come through.
Yeah, that is an incredible moment, and definitely is one of the more emotional in the film. I guess was that like, what was the biggest challenge for you then? Was that like something like that, or is it like the end, like you were talking about? Like, what for you guys was like the hardest sequence maybe to figure out?
Well, I think that was definitely the hardest, because there's so many different elements at play, and the weaving in and out of the music. Michael Giacchino did an amazing score, as he does on all the Marvel movies. So it was just finding, ducking and weaving and working with Kevin O'Connell and just finding the way the shape was going to be. And again, we had Jeff Ford on the stage with us for a lot of it, and just worked our way through it. And it took a long time, but obviously the audiences are speaking for it, so they really, really love it. So
yeah. It's really great. Tony Lamberti, re-recording mixer and sound designer for Spider-Man No Way Home. Thank you so much, Tony. It's great chatting with you. Paul Su, re-recording mixer and supervising sound editor for Lin-Manuel Miranda's Tick Tick Boom. Great film. This is Lin's first time as a director, but obviously I know he worked on In the Heights and stuff. Prior to this, what were your first conversations with him like about like the project and like how it should sound and how he wanted it to sound, and like especially coming at it as a first-time filmmaker? I'm curious like how those conversations went, maybe.
Yeah, well, I think Lin, despite being a first-time filmmaker, came in just really, really smart and informed, frankly. I think maybe just because he's been around the process enough as producer on other films, and really brought a New York sensibility to it, where he said he wanted the music to be big, for it to be really grounded, but for it to really have that connection to the groundedness of big music and forward dialogue, but keeping the connection to the scenes that you're in, not just floating away onto just only musical land, so that was definitely the early conversations were about that, for sure.
So that's great. And I feel like so you get that right away. I feel like with 3090, it's an incredible way to open the film, and it's on the stage, and then you have it like in a bunch of different settings and stuff. And I guess, can you talk about like finding the right sound for that scene? And then I'll ask you about Boho Days, which is another incredible one after this, but I'd love to start with 3090 because I just think that part is so cool. And like, obviously it's jumping around, kind of really setting the stage for the whole film.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like an acrobatic thing where it's all in the script too. That's the amazing thing. It's written in like that. So Lin, actually, the other thing we talked about in the first interview was, he said, look, what I hate is Big Foley, right? Which to him, once you spend one day in the studio with him, you realize Big Foley could be the smallest sound in the world, but he always refers to it as Big Foley. So I don't want the Big Foley in my movie. So it'll be in balance. Like, don't worry about it. No one's going to be overwhelming the music with Foley. But then aside from that, it's really, it's a lot of it's just reverbs and making sure, figuring out what the balance, because, and that's the in 3090 that you mentioned, it's like you're going from on stage to in a verite scene to someone singing back and forth, and all that has to be just very carefully tailored with reverbs. And it's funny because in the studio, everyone is just like they're an expert on music and cutting, they're also an expert on reverb. So as soon as you put the wrong reverb, you hear about it immediately. So it's that sort of hopefully blending into the background of like it not being obvious, but in reality you're changing a lot of stuff from scene to scene. So
it's wild. And then like I mentioned, Boho Days is incredible. Like in the part, for people who haven't seen the film, obviously it's about Jonathan Larson, and Andrew Garfield plays the character, and they're having a party and they start singing the song in the apartment, and it's a lot of like as a Luddite, I was like a lot of natural sound, it felt like, or just happening like on the set. And I guess like it seems incredibly challenging, not just from a performance standpoint for the cast and Andrew, but for the sound obviously as well. And I'd love, like, I think that scene is incredible. Can you talk a little about like having to do that, challenges were, I guess?
Well, yeah, I mean, 90% of the credit there goes to Todd Maitland, who, it's just an incredible, location production mixer. And he So the movie is, there's really a true blend through the film of stuff that's sung on set, stuff that's done to playback, stuff that's done with ADR in the studio afterwards. But Boho Days is it's almost one take essentially. And Todd is just incredibly meticulous with matching lavs and microphones to actors and just capturing the performance. And then what he does is he goes back and he does a pass where they mime and they don't sing, and basically gives me an entire take of the scene with actor production Foley that can be used then to play in the scene. So that just having those those ingredients is really what makes it, because it's just super well recorded.
Yeah, it's incredible. And then other one I want to ask you about, especially from like, I don't know, the mix and stuff is Sunday, because I know like from seeing Lynn's Twitter and stuff, and I know from like behind the scenes that because it had so many different Broadway stars, and obviously because of the coronavirus pandemic and safety protocols, you had not everybody in there at the same time. So you have like, you're kind of mixing and blending all these different actors and performers to make it seem like they're all there, but they're not. And it's a really great trick, because I believe that they were all there. Obviously, I guess how did you guys pull it off?
Yeah, I'm happy that you called that one out, because that's so for the for the shortlist clip, we chose basically the section around Sunday, and Todd and I were back and forth about which section to use in the movie, and it came down to that's Lynn's favorite part of the film, unquestionably. Like, we would play that song in the studio pretty much every day, whether or not we were in that reel. We would go there and play it, and that is that's all ADR. It's it's like 150 tracks of vocals, and so you're going from the the extreme verite of the diner straight into basically a fully ADR scene, with orchestral arrangements. So yeah, it's basically trial and error. You mix the scene over and over and over again until you find the right balance.
I guess, can you talk a little too about like getting their voice? So there's so many incredible Broadway legends in the scene, and if you could really pick them all out, I guess, on this, you know what I mean? And like, I think that's an incredible testament to the mix as well, that I'm like, oh, I could hear Philippa Sue, or like right. Whoever it is, just like I know her voice and I can pick it out.
No, exactly, and that's what Lynn and I spent a lot of time on that scene doing just that. And I do, because I came up as a music mixer before I was ever a film mixer, and then learned to be a sound editor, right? So I employed the music techniques, like you do the vocal down, vocal up mix, or you do the tried and true music method is you listen on severe dim. So you don't just, because the tradition often is we only play the track at 85 in the studio, but for scenes like that, always what I do is I dim it down to where you really have to strain to listen to the mix, and that's how you tell, is that track popping out? Are those legends too loud or too soft? Are they audible, but just barely audible? So
yeah, it's a really great scene, and I think for a treat for anybody who is a Broadway person. The other thing I love, obviously, the film is a 90s period piece, or whatever you want to call it, and you have a lot of, or at least not an insignificant amount of, like VHS tape that I feel like I just love the way that you nail the actual, the sound of a VHS tape. I've dug my parents' old VCR out of the garage like recently, and I was like watching these, and it's just a great sound, and it's so evocative of that time period. I guess, can you talk a little about like mixing that in and making not overdoing it, but also like kind of like nailing how that sounded?
Yeah, like the worldizing techniques are always great. Re-recording stuff, playing it through other devices, and then maybe not always using because the reality of a mix schedule is you set out to worldize everything, and then you realize that the thing that came in on the next to the last day, you're just not gonna have time to do it. So what I do a lot is worldize it, or record IRs of impulse responses of stuff, use that, and then play games with matching and doing stuff with EQ, so that you're not always relying on it, but that's sort of like the backbone of the sound. That's the
right. And then we do have to wrap up, but I'd love to, like, so I mean, it sounds like maybe the Sunday sequence, but like for you, what was like the biggest challenge of this? It's obviously a big musical and like a lot of moving parts, and it sounds great. So like, what was the bigger challenge for you?
Yeah, I mean, Sunday was definitely the big one. Some of the other ones, any of the songs that are interwoven through the scenes are just really challenging, because they, like I was saying before, like everybody's an expert on whether it feels like the thread is really working, and it doesn't. It's like polling the room. You just have to get it to a place where you turn around and nobody has like a little scowl on their face. None of the music editors, none of the music producers, of course not Lynn, none of the the sort of producers who aren't there much, who just show up for one day. Like, you have to make sure that everybody's buying it, and that's when you're done, pretty much.
Yeah. It's great. Also, recording mixer and supervising sound editor for Tick Tick Boom. Thank you so much. Great work, and thank you. James Mathers, sound supervisor for Kenneth Branagh's Belfast. Julian Slater, re-recording mixer and supervising sound editor for Edgar Wright's Last Night in Soho, Tara Webb, sound effects editor, re-recording mixer for Jane Campion's The Power of the Dog, Erik Aadahl and Ethan Van Der Ren, supervising sound editors for John Krasinski's A Quiet Place Part 2, Tony Lamberti, re-recording mixer and sound designer for Spider-Man No Way Home from director John Watts, and Paul Su, re-recording mixer and supervising sound editor for Lin-Manuel Miranda's Tick Tick Boom. Thank you all so much for doing this. I guess, what are you're all, I love talking to you about these films, and I think your work, and I think for people who's watched those films, the sound kind of, you could hear it for yourselves. So I guess for you all, what is something you love about this job and like doing doing your job? I mean, like what excites you about it, and kind of like even now having done, many films and obviously these acclaimed films as well, that still gets you, super enthused for it and excited about it. James, I'll start with you, and we could go around.
Well, I love the collaboration. I love this, listening to the different way people talk about their passion for their craft, and everybody has a different appreciation of, whether it's an appreciation of the audience's take on something or how they have created it for the audience. But more than anything, it's a language. If anybody was listening to this conversation who doesn't know what we do, they're going to be like, what the hell are these guys talking about? But the thread that runs through everybody's piece that I love is we're telling stories. We're telling stories in a certain way that helps a bigger process. We're part of a bigger machine. And that collaboration, I've hugely missed the collaboration over the last couple of years, but it's feeling like it's coming back. It feels like we're getting together again a bit more. Stages are filling out again as we go into mix. It's lovely hearing how everybody's tweaked their narrative and their way of applying their personality to their profession.
Mm-hmm. Julian, how about you?
Well, I'd echo what James has said, and also it's the variety of the movies that one gets to work on. There's nothing. I'm very aware that I get to work on a variety of different things, whether it's the Sorkin stuff or the Edgar Wright stuff or the Jumanji. Every movie is different. Every director is different. How director A says something should sound is invariably different to how director B should sound. And so I just love it. I feel I've just had a reasonably big birthday. I'm going to tell you what the number is. And I feel like I'm so happy that I have a job, if that's what it is, or a career that I love, that I look forward to going into work each day and working with people who are brilliant, people who are amazing, people who show me things that, tricks and things that I didn't know. And to be this far in one's lifelong timeline and still be excited about the thing that takes up the vast majority of what you'll do is it's great. I feel blessed about it, to be honest.
Yeah, I'm just going to echo James and Julian. I love the collaboration. I love working with other sound creatives, and especially when they have a different perspective on things, like, they might come and listen to something and then give me some feedback that I would never have thought of, which then just lifts it even more and brings more to the film, and vice versa. They might get me to have a listen, and I'll bring a different perspective. So I really love that, and I love the variety as well. Like, yeah, it doesn't really feel like a job. Like, you just get to come into work and play around and tell stories, and it's fun.
Yeah, for sure. Erik and Ethan, how about you guys?
For me, I think the thing I love the most is really helping to create moments. I think back to when I started in this business as an apprentice, and I started by going out and recording, sound effects in the field and then bringing them back into the studio. And I remember the first time actually playing around, at a Moviola back then. This was pre-digital, and placing, a single sound against the picture and finding just the sort of magic moment that could be created with the right sound and the right picture, at the right moment to create something bigger and greater than the sum of the parts, really, and sort of creating its own special magic. And that's what really hooked me, on this business and what we do. So I think for me, that's at the heart of it, because it's, something I feel inside, the magic that we can help create. And then, of course, as everyone else has sort of mentioned, the collaboration is huge, because we get to work with the most brilliant people and create together, create magic together. So yeah, it's a really fun thing to be able to participate in.
Nice.
Well, gosh, James, Julian, Tara, and Ethan just took all of my best answers. So I would agree with 100% with all of that. And maybe just one little detail I would add is that there's kind of a personal part of creating sound for me too, that, I think about, I've been recording, building my sound libraries since I was a teenager. And when I go through them, I might just like randomly come across a sound I recorded, 20 years ago. And it's almost like a personal diary where you go back and you're like, you hear it and you're right there, right when it happened. I came across these frogs I recorded in Cambodia for a Terrence Malick movie a couple of days. And I just remember, I heard that. And I just remembered sitting out there for hours in a meditative state in the middle of the night, trying not to get too many mosquito bites. And there's something to me that's just emotional about, you're in a way, your life can kind of be laid out with these sounds in this timeline. And, we have a lot of animals at home. I've recorded every one of them a million times and put them in movies. And I'll just be watching a movie that I'd done and be like, oh, Freya, she made it to 17 and what a great dog. Or so, to me, that's a beautiful personal side to what we do too. It's personal.
Yeah, that's amazing. Tony, how about yourself?
Well, I got to say, they've all hit the nail on the head. Working on movies is the most collaborative art form on the planet, and all these talented artists that we have here today, being able to collaborate with them from time to time. Julian and I have worked together. It's a great joy. It's really a great joy, and when you are able to spend most of your time, because we spend most of our time doing this, more time than I think we spend at home or with our families or whatever. And so when you're able to spend that amount of time working on something over and over and over again, as we do, and every time, and not get tired of it and not get bored of it, and just keep doing great work, that's the true test.
Paul, last but certainly not least, how about yourself?
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, first off, I agree with everything everyone has said clearly, and could have taken any one of those. I think, the love for it, I think is something that we're all blessed to be able to do something that we love that much, as people have said. Like, the fact that you get paid to do it's pretty incredible. But for me, the specific aspect of the collaboration that isn't talked about much is how intimate the process is with the director specifically, on most films, right? And that is something that you can't really, it's really hard to explain how intense and intimate that can be, because they know the project so well, and they've trusted you to take it to another place, and the feeling of them experiencing their own thing in a way that they hadn't imagined is, I don't know how to explain it to someone who hasn't experienced it before. It's pretty incredible. And that for me is really the thing that you can't do anywhere else that I know of. So. Yeah,
it's incredible. And I think, like, obviously, like, if people have watched this, like, the work you're doing on these films, it makes them so, it just makes them the films that they are. Like, we're like, every one of you and has, like, from James, we were talking about, like, with Belfast, and from bringing out Buddy's perspective to every one of these films, I feel like, that are doing that, and, like, kind of, like, really, I think, Eric, you were saying, like, they're like, it really does, the personal that you guys are bringing to it, I think it gives the audience a kind of sense of memory sense as well, and they'll think back on these films and how they sounded, and, like, kind of like, you'll just remember these specific things, and I think they really pop out and stand out. And it's been great chatting with all of you. James Mather from Belfast, Julian Slater, Last Night in Soho, Tara Webb from The Power of the Dog, Erik Aadahl and Ethan Van Der Ryn from Quiet Place Part 2, Tony Lamberti from Spider-Man No Way Home, and Paul Su from Tick Tick Boom. Thank you all so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to spend some time with you guys.
Yeah, and you.
Yeah.
See you all soon.